What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. We're a few days away from the release of George Miller's latest movie, Furiosa. Some of the reviews have already started pouring in, and I thought it'd be a good time to do a video about the overall Mad Max franchise, specifically the best scenes, the best ingredients that go into making this series of films so distinctive and original. Because in my opinion, this is one of the great original franchises in all of movies. There haven't been as many movies as, say, like James Bond or Planet of the Apes, but the concept of Mad Max was invented specifically for the cinema. It's not based on a best-selling book. It's not a remake of an older movie. This is just an insane concept cooked up by director George Miller, as well as his equally insane key collaborators that he's worked with over the years. And having now revisited all four films over the last few days, it just blows my mind all the different ways this creation has continued to evolve in the years since Mad Max first hit the screen back in 1979. And speaking of which, I was always kind of like dimly aware of the fact that Mad Max was a bit of a phenomenon in the late 70s, but I was never aware until I started doing my research for this video just how popular it truly was. So just to put it all in perspective, Mad Max was made independently for roughly $400,000, and it went on to gross worldwide about $100 million. And I just pause for a second and let those numbers soak in, because in 2024 we see a lot of movies that cost, $200 million, and where between their budgets and their marketing costs they really struggle to even break even. And here we have The Little Engine That Could, a movie that was made for $400,000 that grosses $100 million, and that is just, it's fucking staggering. And I tend to romanticize the independent directors of the 1990s, because in the 1990s, that's when I was starting to take an interest in movies, and it was a great time to be a fan of independent cinema in America at that time. But nobody was cooking up ideas that were that successful at that time, no matter how much love and affection I might have had for those filmmakers. And the fact that over the last few decades, George Miller's been able to kind of build upon that initial concept in all sorts of unique and surprising ways, it just makes the creation in the series all the more special. Now, my goal with this video is to focus specifically on my favorite Mad Max moments, as opposed to just regurgitating all the information that I've learned from other sources, whether that's Wikipedia or IMDb or some of the documentaries that I've been watching. However, I am going to give a shout out to two key documentaries that I think people will find intensely interesting. Let's start with Not Quite Hollywood, The Wild Untold Story of Ozploitation. It came out in 2008. And in my opinion, this is one of the best documentaries about film history ever made. And if I ever in any way, shape, or form got to be associated with a project like this, I could basically walk away from the movie industry or walk away from the movie commentary and feel like my time on this earth was well spent. I don't know how many times I've seen that documentary, but a huge part of it is interviewing a lot of the cast and crew that were involved with Mad Max back in the day. And there were already a lot of really cool filmmakers up and running in Australia at that time, like Brian Trenchard Smith, who I interviewed on this channel alongside Paul Murphy a couple years ago, and I'll leave a link to that interview down below. But when Mad Max came along in 1979, it really shook things up. And there's another documentary which focuses specifically just on Mad Max. It's not as good a documentary, but it's got way more information, and that's a movie called The Madness of Max from 2015. And if you've only seen the movie and kind of talked about it with your friends, I strongly recommend people hunt this down, because people like Byron Kennedy really get their due. He sadly died in a helicopter crash back in 1983, but up to that time, he was George Miller's basically like his right-hand man, and they both admit if they had wanted to reverse the roles in Mad Max and have George Miller produce and have Byron Kennedy direct, that would have been equally good. But my favorite stuff in the documentary is everything involving Grant Page. And if you don't know who Grant Page is, he's the closest thing to a superhero that has ever actually walked or crawled on this planet. And thankfully, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, he did a lot of great work in the movies. First as a stuntman and just all-around stud, and then eventually a stunt coordinator. But this is a guy who was, while he had a plaster cast on his face and had his leg in a cast as well, was still doing stunts on Mad Max, like that iconic shot of a car basically blasting through the side of a truck with all that shit flying in all directions. He had his leg in a cast while he was driving that car. I mean, he was just an absolute maniac. But there's so many incredible anecdotes about him in this documentary. Like at one point, he manually removes his own cast because he's just sick of dealing with it. And somebody asks if his leg is hurting, and he says that pain and pleasure go up the same vein for me. I was like, oof, yeah, you're made differently from the rest of us. But he has this other great line where he says, the essence of stunts is to make it look as dangerous as possible and make damn sure it's not. I'm like, God, that's a perfect philosophy. Make it look really dangerous, but make it totally safe behind the scenes. Give the audience the thrill, but no one should get hurt or killed making a movie, even if it looks like they probably should have while making the movie. And I just feel like every single stuntman, every single stunt person, every single stunt coordinator involved in any of the Mad Max movies, they all deserve to take a bow, because whether you like stunts with cars or stunts with weapons or stunts with hand-to-hand combat, these movies have just been a masterclass in some of the best stunts in movie history. But one last anecdote from the madness of Max. There's this great line at the end by George Miller when he's talking about the reception of the movie. And of course now, with all these huge movies and with a giant movie right over the horizon, it's easy to romanticize the history of the Mad Max franchise and just assume that everybody always loved it. But when you hear about some of the initial responses from some critics at that time, it just reminds you of that old cliche that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And while people might be expressing their opinions now on social media as opposed to in a newspaper, but George Miller said his favorite review of the movie at that time came from India, where somebody was complaining about the violence in the movie, and they said the people who made this movie should be dragged into the street and hung. But I guess it was lost on that writer at that time that it makes no sense to object to violence in movies while advocating for actual violence against filmmakers. But before we dig into my official top 10, we do have to discuss a few honorable mentions, because I couldn't live with myself only discussing 10 ingredients from the Mad Max franchise. So let's start with my first encounter with Max. And I can't say for sure, but around 1985, 1986, I either saw Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome on HBO, or I saw the video for the music video for We Don't Need Another Hero on MTV. I mean, Tina Turner was huge at the time, or I very easily could have heard that song on the radio. That song got a lot of airplay or airtime at that time. But it was through Thunderdome that I first got exposed to Mad Max. And I felt then the same way I do now. The movie's fucking awesome, right up into the point where a bunch of kids show up. And for me now, I mean, I just rewatched the movie last night and this morning. When all those kids show up, it's basically like having a bunch of Ewoks show up in a goddamn Mad Max movie. I completely lose all interest in the movie from that point on. However, I love everything initially, and I feel like if you're going to start somewhere with Mad Max, Thunderdome was like, the best is yet to come if that is where you start. But it's interesting, watching it now, you can almost kind of see the seeds being planted for the world building and the universe building that would come many decades later in Mad Max Fury Road, because that initial scene in Bartertown and Thunderdome is quite stylistically, quite a departure from what had come before in the previous two movies. And then I basically kind of forgot all about Mad Max for a few years until True Romance came around in 1993, written by Quentin Tarantino, directed by Tony Scott. And like every teenager in 1993, I basically wore that movie out, watching it over and over and over again. But there's a scene that comes late in the movie where Christian Slater sits down to sell cocaine to a movie producer, and he's giving him praise for the movie Coming Home in a Body Bag, which was made up for True Romance. But he says,
Mad Max, that's a movie. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, that's a movie. Rio Bravo, that's a movie. And Coming Home in a Body Bag, that was a fucking movie.
And at that time, I had not seen Mad Max, nor had I seen The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, nor had I seen Rio Bravo. But as I got a little older and increasingly obsessed with film history, I made a point to hunt down all those movies, and I rapidly became obsessed with all the above. So indirectly, kind of, sorta, I owe Tarantino a little debt of gratitude for just reminding me that there are people out there who fucking love Mad Max intensely. And why do people love Mad Max so intensely? Well, let's talk about a few more of my honorable mentions. Let's talk about some recent history. When the trailer started coming out for Mad Max Fury Road, I remember there's the Comic-Con teaser, which kind of got my attention, but the first full-length trailer, there's one trailer that I love and one that I like less, but the first full-length trailer was just grand opera. And I think of all the movies released in the last 10 years, there's a chance that I've seen that trailer more than any other trailer for any other new release in that time. I just watched it over and over and over, and it's so goddamn cool, and it's so stirring. The trailer's almost too good, where it's like, oh my God, can any movie possibly measure up? Luckily, Fury Road did. I saw it, I think, 3 times in the theater, and I've seen it a few times at home, and I never get tired of it. There's so many great scenes. Like, speaking of honorable mentions, like there's one scene where Max and Furiosa are basically like tag teaming these bikers that are attacking their truck, and the way they're working as a team after initially hating each other and fighting each other so much, it was so cool just seeing them bond by basically just taking out the trash and blowing people away. But it's just, the choreography was just excellent. But another thing that I really like when it comes to honorable mentions, the evolution of the world building, because Mad Max in 1979 took place a few years in the future, and you can see it's a society in a state of decay. You know, the police stations, like it's a mess. It looks like nobody's cleaned that place up in years. And the cops are basically one step away from becoming a biker gang, just like any other biker gang, kind of roaming the streets or roaming the highways, looking for people to kill and molest and destroy and that sort of thing. But then by the time you get to the Road Warrior, it's like they crank it up a notch. It becomes full-blown post-apocalyptic sci-fi, and it's fucking killer. And by the time you get to Thunderdome, it's like, oh my God, like we've gone so apocalyptic. We're almost like in a fantasy movie in a lot of ways, apart from the fact there's no magic or mythical creatures, but it does start to feel increasingly otherworldly. And then by the time we get to Fury Road, I mean, this is just a fully realized different universe where like the way people look at humans almost like machines, like blood banks for the war boys and that sort of thing. Like he just kept adding new stuff to the world, whether that's imperators like Furiosa or the war boys, all my cousins and half brothers and that sort of thing. Naturally, I'm going to like the war boys. But I just love how George Miller's never been content to rest on his laurels. And he's like, yeah, the world's not locked in amber. We are allowed to continue adding little Legos to it and making it more and more impressive over time. But George Miller's not alone in making contributions to this world. Let's talk about the composer Brian May. Mad Max and Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior, as we called it in America, because but when The Road Warrior first came out, I think it had only done, like the first one had only done like 7 or 8 million in the U.S., so there weren't a lot of people who had even seen Mad Max, so they didn't want to call it Mad Max 2 in the U.S., so they were worried that people would be confused. But Brian May composed the score to the first 2 movies, and as much as I love Mel Gibson, as much as I love the car chases, and as much as I love the feral child and all that stuff, those 2 movies they'd be quite different if they did not have those iconic Brian May scores, which are very unusual. It's not like your classic kind of John Williams orchestral score. Like Brian May, he makes a lot of unusual stylistic choices, but I think that those 2 scores are absolutely iconic. But another honorable mention goes to the crazy cast and crew that was willing to join George Miller on all these wild journeys. I mean, one of the most iconic pictures in all of film history is of David Egby on the back of a motorcycle with this huge giant lens on his camera, and he's tied with like a rope or a chain to the motorcycle driver. And you can see in the movie, I think it's footage for Goose when he's riding along the highway, and you can see the speedometer and just how fast the motorcycle is going, but it is just awe-inspiring that anybody allowed David Egby to just hop up on the back of the bike and it's like, let's go. And you can see like the driver like leaning in and Egby's just like, sitting upright, just filming. But you cannot make a mad, insane Mad Max movie unless you have a mad, insane, like borderline suicidal crew that's willing to follow you anywhere you want to go. So yeah, David Egby, holy shit. And also, if you want to hear more from David Egby, he's interviewed extensively in that documentary I mentioned before, Not Quite Hollywood. That documentary, if there's one takeaway from this entire video, it would be for people to watch Not Quite Hollywood. More so even than any of the Mad Max movies, as much as I love the Mad Max movies. But you'll come away from that documentary with a list of roughly 100 films you want to see, whether those are horror films or erotic films or sci-fi films or action films. Now, between the 4 movies that we have at our fingertips, there's obviously a ton of incredibly talented cast members in all those movies, but I do have to give a few shout-outs to some of the OG actors, people like Roger Ward. And Roger Ward, if you watch a lot of Australian movies from the 70s and 80s, like, oh my God, like, there's Roger Ward again, but he's incredible. It's like whether it's the man from Hong Kong or whatever the case might be, but he is a total fucking badass and just so big and strong and studly. But he's awesome. But any movie with Roger Ward, it's automatically a better movie. But also finding actors like Hugh Keys-Byrne, if I'm saying his last name correctly. Sadly, he died a couple years ago, but he was so good in the first Mad Max that they had to bring him back as a Morton Joe in Fury Road decades later. And the great crime against Mad Max back in 1979 is that very few territories actually got to see his performance with his voice. In their infinite wisdom, the American distributor decided to dub over the movie to eliminate all the Australian accents. And so for many, many years, a lot of people had only seen the butchered version of Mad Max, whereas people in Australia had obviously seen it with the correct accents. But thankfully, I was only 3 years old at the time, and I did not have to be subjected to the redubbing of Mad Max. But when you watch it now, a huge performance, it's just so eerie and so powerful, and just little weird touches like doing a different accent in every scene just to make him seem that much more strange. And also just the fact that his name is Toe Cutter. I mean, just the names throughout this series, whether it's the names of the locations like Bartertown or what's the one in Fury Road, like the Bullet Makers, or anyway. But the cities have cool names, but the characters have cool names like People Eater and people like that. George Miller just has a real knack for coming up with these names where you don't even need a lot of information about who they are. Or like, I hate the conventional wisdom that every character needs an arc. Not really. Sometimes you just need a good scene or a good look or a cool name. And calling people toe cutter and people eater, I eat that shit up. And speaking of crazy names for crazy characters, you cannot do better than Lord Humongous from The Road Warrior. And you want to talk about cultural influence. You can see this character and feel his influence in so many other worlds, especially in animation like South Park. You can tell Trey Parker and Matt Stone grew up watching Mad Max 2 because they're constantly sprinkling in little references to The Road Warrior.
Just walk away. You can put a stop to all this. Just walk away, and we will spare your lives. Just walk away.
He's pretty good.
But my favorite example of the cultural influence of The Road Warrior has got to be the animated series and feature film made from Fist of the North Star. There's a character who basically looks just like Lord Humongous, and he's got like the burns and the veins pulsing and that sort of thing. But like, I feel like if really cool Japanese animation is stealing your characters and your ideas, like you're on the right track. And I don't know if it was ever confirmed or if it was just hinted at. I don't know if it was an idea that was originally inserted in the movie and then left out or what. But at one point in the screenplay, it was suggested that Lord Humongous might actually be Goose from the first movie because of all the burns all over his body. And I just love that. I wish we knew more about what happened to Goose after surviving all those horrible burns. But it makes sense to me that that might be Goose when you see how one of his minions, one of his henchmen in The Road Warrior is dressed like a cop from the first movie. But in the end, movies are all about emotion, and no matter how many cool stunts you have or car chases you have or cool names for characters, none of that matters if the movie's not having an emotional impact on you. And I was rewatching Fury Road this morning, and when we got to the end of the movie where Nicholas Holt's character is about to sacrifice himself so that everybody else can escape, and he looks and he makes eye contact with Riley Keough's character, and he just whispers, witness. And I can't remember if he just says witness or witness me, but he makes eye contact with her and says, witness. He spins the wheel, and saves the day. And for like 20 sustained seconds, I'm getting it again now, I could feel goosebumps going up my neck. I was like, God damn, I've seen this movie so many times. How is it still having this emotional impact on me? And what it reminded me of, I took my my little brother to see this in the theater. He would have been 13 when it came out. He had a friend over to play. They wanted to go to the movies. I was like, guys, I got something special for you. We are going to go see Mad Max Fury Road in IMAX 3D. They're like, what's Mad Max? I was like, well, you're about to find out. So I took them to see that. And throughout the movie, I couldn't quite tell if it was like, getting to them and to the degree that I would like it to. And then we left the theater, and I was, talking a mile a minute about me getting in the car, and we're driving home, and neither of them were talking. And I was like, dude, like, what's going on? Like, what do you think of the movie? And he says, dude, that was like amazing. And he was just stunned. He was in a state of, like a hushed state of awe, because he had never seen anything like it. He grew up in the era of Harry Potter and Marvel and all this stuff, like, franchises that give people a lot of joy and they're a lot of fun, but he'd never experienced like this wild, crazed, intense, potent, visionary epic on that scale before. And so he was just totally sideswiped. And I feel like that is why people love Mad Max all these decades later, because it's fucking amazing. But with all that out of the way, let's dive into my official top 10 list. My top 10 favorite scenes or moments or ingredients from the history of the Mad Max franchise. And for my number 10, we're going to start with the immortal line from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Because no matter how many problems I might have with that particular movie, there's no denying that is one hell of a scene. And it's incredible, like when you talk about the influence of the Mad Max franchise, I still hear that line pretty much every week whenever I'm watching the UFC, because inevitably, throughout the course of an evening, when 2 people are entering the octagon to fight, one of the commentators is going to say, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. And I don't know if that phrase was coined by this movie or popularized, but whether you're talking about boxing or MMA, that line is alive and well, nearly 30, when the hell is 19? Yeah, nearly 40 years later, and Jesus Christ, I'm old. But that scene is absolutely incredible. Watching Max and Blaster throw down while Master looks down. And, the bungee cords are ridiculous, but it is kind of fun watching Max flip into the air and grabbing spears and swords and chainsaws and all that stuff. It's a wild scene, all while Tina Turner, who shaved her head for the movie just so she could have that outrageous wig as she's looking down, because she has secretly hired Max to help her take over Bartertown. She doesn't like the fact that Master has basically cornered the market on methane, and methane is the one energy source that runs that town. So it's basically a big, giant, epic pissing contest about pig shit. And it's delightful. So yeah, I remember throughout college, for whatever reason, anytime people were about to square off over anything, someone would say 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. So Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, it's a flawed movie, but it does have its moments. And for my number 9, I'm going to go with an unusual choice, but I'm going with the poster by Noriyoshi Arai for Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior, as it was called in the US. And I feel like a lot of times people overlook the value of a great movie poster. A movie poster is basically a work of art that will enhance your appreciation of a movie and deepen your appreciation. And my apartment, it's covered with framed movie posters. And there's something about when you look at a certain movie poster every goddamn day where it just becomes a part of your home and your life, and it just allows you to internalize the experience. And nothing makes me more frustrated when I hear people saying, oh, but they're just marketing materials. Like, who cares? But like these days, there's so many just grotesque movie posters and also grotesque Blu-ray covers. It's like, just go with the original poster if like nothing else suits. But like when you see just like a crummy kind of phoned in Photoshop job that was done by somebody in 20 minutes, like there's just no substitute for a great work of art by an interesting artist. Like even if you're talking about Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, the very last movie poster that was ever done by Richard Amsel was for Thunderdome, and he had done Raiders of the Lost Ark and Flash Gordon and Chinatown and The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean. And the money was totally worth it. But getting back to Arai, everything about his poster perfectly captures the spirit of the movie, like the injured left eye for Max. And if you look closely in Thunderdome, you can see that his left eye is still permanently dilated from that injury. But also, I love how it captures this, like the piecemeal nature of his uniform, because you've got some ingredients from when he was a cop before society completely collapsed. But you also have his brace on his left leg from where he got shot in the first movie. And I just feel like as good as some of the other Mad Max posters are, and there are a lot of good ones, Noriyoshi Arai's poster, and he did a lot of great ones for Godzilla. He's one of the legends. He did some good Star Wars posters, but this poster I feel like definitely belongs on my top 10 list. But let's move into my number 8, which is a little more complicated because it's a scene that involves so many cool moments where it could almost be a top 10 list unto itself. And I'm talking about the intro to Mad Max from 1979, because you have a couple things going on simultaneously. First of all, you have Knight Rider being pursued by cops saying all sorts of crazy shit like,
I'm a fuel-injected suicide machine. I'm a rocker. I'm a roller. I'm a controller.
like lyrics from a song. I think some of those lines actually were lyrics from songs that they stole for the movie. So you've got that crazy chasing going on. But throughout the scene, you've got this long, slow tease of Mad Max's character where you see like different parts of him or different parts of his vehicle. You never really see him in full until you get this insane stunt where they actually attached a fucking rocket to the back of the car. The rocket, then somehow they got it for free, but the rocket kind of malfunctioned during the initial stunt, and it swerved around what it was supposed to hit, but flipped around backwards. But they found a way to still use the footage and just have it crash backward into something, and we get our first bulging, inflating eye thing. But after he explodes, then we finally get our big reveal of Mad Max as he steps into frame and looks at the explosion. And I feel like that entire scene is just a masterclass in building suspense, but also kick-ass stunts. And even though this might sound like heresy, because, Mad Max Fury Road has great chase scenes, and The Road Warrior has great chase scenes, my favorite driving scenes in Mad Max are the opening and the closing of the original film, where it's no frills, no bullshit. It's just crazy people with cars doing crazy stunts, very few special effects. It's just, down and dirty guerrilla filmmaking on the street. And there's something about the look of those scenes and the way they're framed and the way they're composed. I just think it's an absolutely stunning movie visually, and you cannot do better than the opening of Mad Max from 1979, unless we're talking about the next 7 things on my list. So let's move on to number 7, Vernon Wells as Wes from The Road Warrior. Now, as much as I would love to be able to say that my first encounter with Vernon Wells was in Mad Max 2, it was not. I first saw him in Weird Science way back in the day. Party runs amok, and suddenly all these mutants from apocalyptic movies, or like characters from like The Hills Have Eyes and that sort of thing, they all show up and just rip the party to pieces. And it was just an absolutely crazy scene. But little did I know that Vernon Wells had done an even better job of that character a few years prior. And I feel like if there's one character in all 4 films that I've seen so far who is the perfect embodiment of the insanity of this world, it's got to be Vernon Wells, where his screams, his rage, his look, I mean, everything he does is with maximum intensity. Like, he is the poster child for apocalyptic punk rock. And the fact that he's just got like his bare ass on display the entire movie is hilarious. And people talk about like whether it's assless chaps or whatever, but Mel Gibson apparently called him, I think he called him like the butt cheek barometer or what. He had some name for him. Hang on, I'm going to find this real quick. Barometer Bum was Mel Gibson's nickname for him because it was actually freezing when they were shooting that movie. It looked hot, but it was freezing. And when they said when his butt cheeks would start to turn purple, they knew everybody had to go into the bus and bundle up with blankets and start warming up. So Vernon Wells, who knows, maybe the fact that his ass was exposed during that shoot, he saved people from getting sick or catching a cold or whatever the case might be. But just like that little crossbow in his arm. Yeah, if there's a spirit to these movies or a spiritual through line, it's got to be Vernon Wells. But for my number 6, we're going with a scene that was the very first scene that popped in my head when I thought about which scenes would go on a top 10 list. And there's a moment in Mad Max Fury Road that I'll never forget where you've got the truck breaking away from what everybody's expecting, and you got some bandits attacking them while Immortan Joe and his crew are trying to cut them off. But initially, the war boys are fighting to protect the truck from these bandits with those spiked cars. And this one guy, he shoots like these crossbow bolts into the face of one of the war boys. He's like, oh, and like he catches one through the shoulder and one like through like the cheek and out the back of his head. And he's like, starting to die. And everybody's like, oh, come on, like, you can do it, you can do it. And he stands up and just sprays the chrome on his face. He's like, witness me. And I was like, witness. And everybody starts screaming as he leaps off with those goddamn explosive spears.
Witness me!
That shot and profile of him flying through the air, definitely the most iconic shot from that entire movie. And I remember even during the trailer, there's a line where somebody says something like, everybody's gone out of their mind. And you hear that over the shot of him. And because I had not yet seen the movie, I didn't know what all the chrome was. I was like, was that saliva? Like, what's going on? What's all that silvery stuff, kind of spittle coming out of his mouth? But you want to talk about Vernon Wells as Wes, kind of personifying like the mad spirit of this realm. That shot of the war boy leaping through the air, it's pretty goddamn cool as well. So as somebody who loves the war boys, I mean, you could say also on the same level, Nicholas Hoult saying, like, oh, like, what a day.
Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
What a lovely day. And as great as his line reading is for that scene, I have to go with the war boy leaping through the air with those goddamn explosives. It's just so goddamn cool. But I mentioned before the boomerang scene from Mad Max 2. So for my number 5, we're going with the feral child and his boomerang, because that whole scene is just too insane to be believed. Like, anytime I bump into somebody who saw the Mad Max movies but has kind of forgotten them, the one thing they do remember, like, oh my God, like, what's the deal with that feral child who throws the boomerang and it catches the guy in the face? And then you see another guy getting his fingers chopped off before he does the backflip. Like, everything about that scene is just too insane to be believed. The fact that there is just a feral child to begin with in this movie who spends the entire movie growling and roaring and screaming. I mean, one of the funniest moments in all of movie history is when he and Wes come face to face at the end, and he shrieks right before the two cars collide. You might be thinking it sounds a little hypocritical, or I'm contradicting myself by saying I like the feral child and the road warrior, while I hate the kids from Beyond Thunderdome. And I guess if there had been like 50 of them, it would have been excessive. Where there's something about having the one feral child, and also the way he reacts to things that Mel Gibson does, and he's always got that weird smile where it's like, I'm amazed the kid even has like teeth or a tongue. He just seems so primitive. And anyway, that scene with the boomerang catching the dude in the head, it's fucking hilarious. It's so violent and so disturbing, and it's just yet another iconic moment in the history of the Mad Max franchise. Now, for my number 4, I'm going to kind of cheat, but I'm basically going to go with like the last 20 minutes of Mad Max 2 for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's an incredible homage to John Ford's film Stagecoach from 1939, where That obviously has got a horse-drawn carriage and people on horses, and it only lasts about 8 minutes. But if you watch that scene, first and foremost, Yakima Canutt, if I'm saying his name correctly, so those are some of the most glorious stunts in movie history from that time. And those stunts have continued to inspire filmmakers in all the decades since, in particular George Miller. But George Miller obviously takes his inspiration from a lot of places. Like, he talked about how when he was editing Mad Max from 1979, he took his inspiration from silent movies. He was editing the movie almost like trying to disregard sound, because he knew if the movie would just play well visually like a silent movie, you could play it anywhere in the world and the movie would do just fine, even if horribly redubbed with atrocious American accents, as was initially the case. But the moment that I love most in The Road Warrior, like I would say on a technical level, I prefer the Fury Road chases because they're just so much more outlandish and so much more expensive and just so much more insane. But there's something about just a simple stunt that never loses its luster for me. And so we have to pause for a moment and give a shout out to the actor or the stuntman named Guy Norris. There's a scene where you have this incredible shot where Mad Max looks out the window, blasts somebody with a shotgun, all sorts of hell breaks loose, and a motorcycler hits a car and goes flying over the car, somersaulting. And if you see, as he starts his somersault, he hits his leg on the car, and he broke his goddamn femur. And I don't know, like, right now, take your hand, put it on your leg. That is the thickest, strongest bone in your entire body. The fact that he broke his femur doing that stunt and that it made it into the final cut, it's one of the most insane stunts that I've ever seen, where just that momentum going through the air, where you can just see that the stunt people and this crew, they are putting quite literally life and limb on the line to get the shot. And I think that's one of the most iconic moments in the history of stunts in cinema. You have to give credit where credit is due, and I think that chase scene is why many people regard The Road Warrior as being one of the strongest sequels ever made in any franchise. I mean, you could say, oh, Godfather 2, or actually, what are the great sequels? Well, there are a lot of good sequels out there, but Godfather 2 would be the first one that comes to mind. But right behind it, maybe Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, or obviously The Empire Strikes Back. I mean, like, film history has a lot of good sequels to speak of, but goddamn, you want to talk about cult classics and just masterclasses and stunts and driving and insanity, you cannot beat Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. But let's push on to my number 3, where we're going to go back to 1979, where we see the transformation of Max into what he becomes. Because Mad Max, you can always tell that he's trying desperately not to become the people that he chases out on the highways, and you can see him wrestling with all this internal torment. And then there comes a moment where he just crosses over and becomes a full-blown anti-hero in one of the great 1970s revenge movies. And it's a combination of things, but obviously getting shot through the leg and having your arm run over, it's no kind of fun. But the death of his family, when you see that shot where you see the mother running with the child with a bunch of bikers coming behind her, and the violence is only implied. Everybody thinks that Mad Max is some crazy violent movie, but it's implied more often than not off screen, because the cyclists, or the riders, whatever you call them, they blast by, and you see a ball and a shoe just boom, 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 bounce on the road. And it's so perfectly staged, it's so perfectly executed. And at that moment, you know that Mad Max's life is over. And obviously, she's still alive and she goes to the hospital, but she's not expected to recover. But that's a real turning point. I feel like no matter what your action movie is, no matter what your revenge saga is, or your sci-fi epic is, your character, your central character, your protagonist, he needs to get the shit kicked out of him. He needs to experience real horror, real torment. And while you can beat him up and beat him to death and injure him, there's nothing quite like the murder of your family to really give you a surge of motivation. And the 70s had a lot of good revenge sagas. I mean, you could talk about Death Wish, or you could talk about Rolling Thunder. I mean, there was a lot of there's revenge was in the air. But I think, Mad Max, well, it's going to lead to my number 2, because I think one of the most satisfying moments out of any revenge movie is my number 2, and it involves some handcuffs and a character known as Johnny the Boy, played by Tim Burns, where you would think the whole movie would be leading up to this epic confrontation with Toe Cutter, but Johnny the Boy is one of the more deranged lunatics in this movie, and just always kind of speaking in gibberish and making all these strange sounds. You can tell he's just like a mad dog who's gotten off his chain. And there's something so ominous about the way Mad Max finds him, kind of corners him, and Johnny the Boy is trying to act innocent initially. And the way Mel Gibson, in just such merciless, grim fashion, explains to him, well, here's a hacksaw, here are the handcuffs. Probably take you about 10 minutes to cut through that steel, but if you cut through your leg, it's going to take about a minute. Maybe you'll survive. That scene's so iconic and so impactful that it would inspire an entire film franchise that is still running to the present day. Saw, I mean, in the documentary Not Quite Hollywood, the co-directors of the first Saw admit, yeah, that scene inspired Saw, and here we are in 2024, they're still making Saw. They made 10 Saw movies. They made twice as many Saw movies as they have Mad Max. But that scene is astonishing. And I think that's one of the main reasons why a lot of people just could not handle the movie, where you just see Mel Gibson driving away really slowly in the Interceptor as that explosion goes off. And if you watch the documentary, what the hell's it called again? I'm blanking on the name. The Madness of Max. They talk about how they had to get it all in one take. Most of the great scenes in this movie, they had to get it in one take, but they knew they had like the landscape, they had the car, and they wanted to get the explosion. But they're worried, say the explosion goes high and then billows out, well, then it would be out of the frame. Or if the driver goes too quickly, maybe like the explosion would be too far behind. And so there were a lot of moving pieces, but somehow it all just came out perfectly. I mean, maybe he's driving a little bit too slowly, but I think that makes it all the more chilling when you see how Mad Max, like this, for the time being, his revenge is at an end, or his lust for revenge has been satisfied. But just watching that total transformation of his character, it's really incredible stuff, and I feel like that's when Max really becomes Mad Max. But at long last, we come to my favorite scene in the history of the Mad Max franchise, and it's got to be the intro, the opening to Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior, where we get an initially in 4:3 aspect ratio, a kind of a black and white recap of just how the world just went to shit. Where, like, oil shortages and civil unrest, and basically like a society in total decay and war and famine, etc. and so forth. And then it slowly but surely starts shifting from stock footage into scenes that we all know from Mad Max from 1979. And if you're an American audience member just seeing The Road Warrior without any idea of like what the hell Mad Max even was, I do feel like it kind of gets you up to speed and shows you a few iconic scenes and would whet your appetite to try to hunt it down, because this was right when VHS and like kind of VCR culture was really taking hold. And you could hunt down Mad Max, even though it would be in pan and scan with crummy American dubbed voices. But that intro, as we start seeing the black and white scenes from his life, there's a transition point. And then suddenly, boom, the movie is in widescreen and it's in color, and you see Max in the Interceptor blasting along, and it just throws you headfirst right into a fight scene, right into a chase scene like the original Mad Max. And I'm like, all right, y'all have perfectly set the tone. I know the world, I know the character, and it's just... it is as cool as dystopian, futuristic, apocalyptic sci-fi gets. And I feel like game series like the Fallout series clearly owe a huge debt of gratitude to The Road Warrior. I feel like anybody making dystopian sci-fi games and or movies probably owes a debt of gratitude to The Road Warrior in some way, shape, or form. And when you see all the kind of cheesy, low-budget Italian knockoffs of The Road Warrior that were made throughout the 80s. Like, it is one of the most influential movies ever made in the history of the science fiction genre. And I think that first scene is just a masterclass in setting up the lore, setting up the rules of the world, and just throwing you right into the action, and then just, hold on to your chair, because it's going to be a hell of a fucking ride from that point on. In any case, those are my favorite scenes and ingredients from the Mad Max franchise so far, but who knows? Maybe Furiosa will give me 2 or 3 more scenes or beats or characters that I want to add to the mix, but it's one of those things where anytime I don't have access to a movie early, I'm going to be seeing it next Thursday, but when I see reviews start coming out, I start getting that, like, FOMO, like fear of missing out. I start getting jealous that people are already talking about a movie. I'm like, well, I want to talk about Mad Max 2. And the only way I could kind of insert myself into the Mad Max conversation right now was just by revisiting the movies and revisiting the documentaries. And they were just an absolute fucking blast. And if this channel can serve one purpose, if I can successfully occasionally convince somebody to see an old movie that they've never seen before, and even better, expose them to an old movie that they fall in love with, and then recommend to their friends or their family members or whatever, then my work here is done. And so I love doing these videos where I get to explore film history, especially when it's connected to something going on in contemporary movies. And for anybody who's been in love with movies for a long time, inevitably you reach a stage where your heroes, people that you look up to, are either going to start retiring or pushing on. And the reality is, like, most of the icons from the 1970s, my favorite decade of movies, they're pretty goddamn old or they're already dead. And the fact that George Miller is still in the game at this level, at this scale, making movies that are, playing at the Cannes Film Festival and getting like a 10-minute standing ovation or 7-minute standing ovation and getting a wide release, there are just not that many filmmakers of his age that can make that claim. Like Martin Scorsese is in that conversation. In their 80s, you got people like Paul Verhoeven or like Woody Allen, or in their 90s, you got Clint Eastwood. Paul Schrader is still around, but slowly but surely the giants of the 1970s are starting to kind of wind things down. Or Francis Ford Coppola, he just got a 10-minute standing ovation at the Cannes Film Festival for his movie Megalopolis. People were joking about how nobody's going to be able to review the movie because they're too busy giving it a standing ovation the whole time. I'm dying to see that movie myself, but if I can occasionally make a video where I bring people up to speed on the legendary careers of these legendary figures, well then, that is my favorite use of this channel. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, perhaps sharing the video with your friends, or go one better, invite a few friends over, pop a few beers, and watch Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. And you can thank me later, but thanks again for watching this video. I greatly appreciate it, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.